Thank you, Amy, so much, and MarinMOCA, this is such a great honor. And unfortunately, I was talking with Susan probably last week, and it's amazing how this space is still considered a secret. Like, people still do not know about it. I've been here, we've been here in California probably 23 years now, and I've known about this place probably about 15 years ago. And the fact that it's such a great treasure that people still don't know about it. I hope once you all leave, you all can kind of spread the word that this gym is actually here. It's such a great art community. And this residency, they've been doing this for 5 years. I'm fortunate. Here's another, I always put him on the spot here. That's the Martin Times. He's also an artist. He was an artist. And so it's just a lot of great artists. We know this area has a lot of great artists here. So this is one way that you can actually see and find out about. So spread the word. So, regarding me and my art, I don't want to do the whole, when I was young, I walked through the snow for 5 miles, but I've always been an artist. And I always start the story off by letting people know that I was born in Memphis, Tennessee, and I was actually born 5 months after Dr. King was assassinated. And the reason I give that is because that's always been a part of me, being in the city, there's a lot of treasure there in the city, and the city of a lot of unrest, civil unrest was there. Because Memphis, Tennessee was trying to find its identity, right? Being known for assassinating a great peacemaker, having to deal with that, and just growing up in that. I'm glad I did grow up in that area because I learned who I was. Had 2 wonderful parents who continued to tell me who I was, right? My difference and being different, which is a great thing because we all are. And so with that, art was always my voice. I loved comic books, and so I felt art was my superpower. I was a student that had a learning difference. So I was one of those kids who couldn't grasp onto things, and so because I felt isolated in that, art was my escape for that. And so with that said, art is my breath. And so even though growing up, trying to figure out, I always knew I wanted to be an artist. What kind I didn't know, right? When I was younger, it was one of those, I wanted to draw album covers because, album covers like Journey, Cameo, all the jazz musicians, you saw all this great artwork, because that's when we had vinyl then. Wanted to be an album cover designer, then moved to fashion designer, then moved to comic book artist. So art has always been a part of my world. And I eventually got a degree in graphic design. And hopefully you can kind of see as I talk about some of the pieces. But I remember before becoming a graphic designer going to school, I always heard about the rivalry between fine artists and graphic artists. And they always felt that you couldn't be one. And I had a problem with that because I asked why. I felt that I was an artist. They said, well, graphic artists, you create from the outside in. Fine artists create from the inside out. And I really didn't understand that because being a graphic designer for 25 years, I'm like, what are they? But now being a fine artist, now maturing, not only as an individual and as a man, but also as an artist, I truly understand it. Graphic design, you focus so much on some of those tangible things, which is great, right? Design aspect, right? A lot of the technical things that come with a lot of the advertising that you see. And with fine artists, it's more about the emotion, what connects with you. Not worrying about exact lines, but more about the energy and the movement that's within the piece of what you feel or what you connect with. So my goal with this residency, I know I'm kind of chopping it away to kind of get to this point. My goal for this residency was to bring both worlds together. Being a graphic designer for 20-something years and a fine artist for, I don't know how many years, I always thought I was a fine artist, I did realize that there was this divide. And so hopefully these pieces, you can kind of see a culmination of that. And I am going to kind of talk about the transition because I think that's another key aspect for me as an artist too, is understanding my growth as an individual and allowing the art to actually speak to that. So with this series, Bridges and Walls, it actually stemmed from, it's been culminating in my mind for a while. I realized that a lot of my work was very heavily socially conscious. And as I said, growing up in Memphis, Tennessee, being around it, 2 parents who were educated, constantly telling me about the history. I couldn't run from it, and I actually tried. I tried running from it because you can see that it's a heavy topic. It's a topic that can really weigh on you, and that's where that fine arts come in because it's something personable, right? To where you're pulling from these experiences, and when you're constantly reliving some experiences, it can weigh heavy on you. And so fine art or abstract expressionism, which are actually these 2 pieces here to the extreme, is where you just totally negate a lot of the ideas and images that you think you see and deal more with kind of the emotion. And for me, that was my getaway. That was my escape. Just to be able to live in the emotion and to kind of create, allowing the paint and the medium to kind of guide me, truly, being submissive to that. Instead of me actually guiding it, I allowed it to actually guide me. And so with this series, I wanted to figure out how can I bring them kind of both together. And it was a challenge. It was a challenge at first. The first 3 months of this year residency, it was blank canvas. My wife, Mikhail, will hear me kind of grumble a lot, like, what am I going to do for this thing? Again, trying to force it, not allowing it to happen, not allowing it to be organic. And then something clicked and said, well, as you do this, why does it all have to be based on this one ideal? Why can't it be a transition? Because as an artist, you transition. And so I thought back to my series Endangered Species, which 2 of the pieces is what Amy talked about, that was in the Young Museum. And it dealt with African-American men, my journey as African-American men, and of course, because of the atrocities that we all experienced during the pandemic with George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor, to where we all had to sit there and watch this tragedy. Endangered Species kind of spoke on that, things that I saw and seeing it finally kind of come to a pinnacle. And then with this show, this is kind of the extension of that. Because the one thing I think we all noticed, and we even heard comments from people even who were around during the 60s and the 40s who talked about how there's always kind of been this divide, because we know with racism, among a lot of other social injustices that we experience here in America, racism, unfortunately, is one of the key ones, where there's always kind of been that divide, but recently it's been very divisive. And unfortunately, on both sides, we've struggled from that. And I thought about, as we have these encounters, because as human beings, we're going to have encounters whether we want them to or not, right? And so I thought about that. As an encounter, when I encounter someone, when I meet with someone, what am I building? Because regardless of if we try to or not, you leave an impression, and that impression creates some kind of connection, whether it's positive or negative. And so that's where the idea kind of stemmed from with bridges and walls. Am I creating a bridge, connecting with you, someone who I don't know, who I meet, want to know more about them, hopefully they want to know about me? Or do I get to a point in this world where we have this kind of divisiveness to where it's like, you know what, I want to build a wall. Why? Because I don't want to connect with anyone, right? I'm afraid to connect with someone, or I'm afraid of how they might respond. And I felt that was kind of the gist of it all, of what we're living in today. We're living in such a digital world that's making us become isolated. It's telling us to be better isolated, especially our youth. Being a teacher, that's something I always talk about, and I have 2 teenagers, to where, and just to kind of throw on the side note, we just traveled. And I love traveling to watch my kids, one who is 18, freshman in college, and the other is a sophomore in high school. And it's amazing, you could be in a beautiful place and you can see all the adults like, oh, this is so gorgeous. Did you see that so-and-so? Yep. To where that's their world. Their world is taking a picture of where we are and then looking at it. So I think about that, bridges and walls. What are we creating? And so that's the gist of this exhibit, because I thought about my own life. We hear, especially with racism, it becomes one-sided. We always want to talk about the plight of African Americans. We kind of know the history. But as I have conversations, I said, I have a duty as well to talk, right, and to share. And that's where I think we have to kind of tear down the wall of us being afraid to talk to each other and have that encounter, because one, you feeling that you might offend me by a question you might ask or a comment you say, and me being afraid to express because I don't want you to say, oh, you're complaining, you're whining, get over it. Because those are the 2 things we hear from both sides. And that's the thing that I feel we have to get rid of in order for us to have a community. I want to end with this, and then I'll kind of talk about my pieces. I have a friend from church who talked about visiting Canada. And I've mentioned this before, and I love this, where they talked about the person she met from Canada said, you know, you Americans have it wrong. She said, what do you mean? She said, you all are so big about this melting pot. She said, in Canada, we believe in a mosaic. When you think about a mosaic, every piece is different, but every piece is gorgeous. Every piece has something that's true to it. When you get a melting pot, what do? You put everything in one pot, you melt it, and it becomes some ugly color. Let's be real. It's never a pretty color. It's dingy, it doesn't have life. And when you think about that, that's what we do. We don't celebrate each other's difference. We take each other's difference and we negate it for the wrong reasons, regardless of where it is. And when we do that, we then have this self-hate, or this is one of the pieces I talk about, colorism as an African-American man, to where you feel like you don't bring anything to the table, so that self-hate tends to overtake you. Then that mosaic that once was beautiful, or that element that you bring to the table that was once beautiful, is now muted because of the self-hate, because of the negate that we have and what we live in. And so that's what these pieces are. And I kind of want to start with the transition for you. So I apologize because you all are probably doing a lot of the moving around. But I talked about the two worlds. I want to go back to that point of graphic design and fine artist. I was an illustrator and a graphic designer. And in a few of these pieces, this piece here that you see is called This Is My Land. I'll speak a little bit about each piece. And then the one next to it, which is Tilling the Soul. Those pieces were kind of the last pieces for the endangered species. And the reason being is because of the subject matter, whereas I love combining historical aspects into my work. I love mixed media collage because I want to pull the viewer in. I don't want the viewer just to walk by and say, oh, that's cool, that's pretty, that's neat, and keep walking. I want them to see something in it and say, what is that? Is that a mistake? Or whatever it is, to help engage them into coming into the piece, to look a little closer, and then to see the elements that are there. This Was My Land was based on the historical revolution or overtaking of Black communities in America. During the 1800s, mid-1800s or so, there were so many places, and I'm pretty sure recently we heard about Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma. That was a prominent area. There was the Memphis Massacre, where I'm from, in 1866. You had Rosewood, you had so many other smaller communities. And don't quote me, I'm not a historian, but I know it's kind of on the verge of the Jim Crow time, or when they were actually starting to move in that transition to where, unfortunately, poor whites, as well as some poor Blacks, poor whites felt that they were cheated. Poor whites felt that there was this movement for those African Americans who were once slaves now became free, to where they felt that they were given these things. And in that same land that they shared crops and worked on, they felt that they were being cheated as well. That's kind of a little bit of the history. Please research more because it's really deep content. But what happened is they actually came into these lands and overtook these lands. They murdered, they assassinated kids, women, children. And one town is actually here in California, which is Allensworth, California, which is right up the way. It was a general who was actually a general in the Army who actually bought that land and created this beautiful Black community. And of course, his land was overtaken. It's still a community today. You can actually take the train up there and see. And so that's what that piece is talking about there. This was once my land, bringing up the history that a lot of us, we didn't learn about in high school, right, unfortunately. And the one next to it, Tilling My Soul, that was actually a tribute to my grandfather, who was a sharecropper, and I love telling this story. He had 9 kids, and 7 of his 9 kids he put through college. Now, the reason that's a great story is because he actually was in World War II, fought in World War II. And when he came back, the men during that time, the soldiers during that time, got bonuses. And unfortunately, certain states, and Tennessee was one of them, to where, because of the sharecropping industry, that's where you probably heard the story where what they did was they increased the interest to where basically these men of color who were sharecroppers could never get out of debt. So even though they worked hard so they could eventually buy the land that they sharecropped, because of the ruling, they never could. And so my grandfather, who got a telegram call from his cousin in Chicago, asked if he got the bonus so he could buy the land that he had sharecropped for so long. And back then the bonus was $5,000. We're talking about in 1940. $5,000. And he didn't get that money. And so, being heartbroken, he still said, I need to make sure that my kids get an education. He had an 8th grade education. And he actually put 7 of his 9 kids through college, and they all became what? Educators. Here I am. So that's kind of a tribute to him. I was fortunate enough to actually visit him. He passed when I was actually in college. So, Papa John, he was, dear to me, to where I would hear all these stories and just the hard work that he did. And so that was kind of a tribute to him in that piece. And so from those pieces, and of course this piece here, which is Love and Hate, it's called Colorism. I kind of spoke about that. Self-hate, especially in the Black community, especially with African American men, being told for so many years that we were 3/4 of a human being. trying to find out who we were. And I took that was actually inspired, and I don't know how many of you have seen the Spike Lee movie, Do the Right Thing, Radio Raheem, where he has these things. And so love that movie, and I actually thought about that too. And so the elements in that piece, if you notice in the faces, and you can see it in this piece that I'm going to talk about right to the side, a lot of the pieces that I do, I like to create a face out of different features. And one reason for that is, even though we are a human race, we all are different, and we're beautiful in our difference. But unfortunately, as a man of color, I've heard this many times when I was kind of stopped, pulled over, walking through a mall, to where you kind of fit the description, right? Because unfortunately, there was a time where they felt all men of color kind of look alike. And so it was kind of a ploy off of that, showing that even though it's one person, you can tell the difference, right? The features are different, that we all don't look the same. And so I use that in that piece to kind of show that, even though we're different, we kind of have that same experience, and that same experience is what we've experienced as men of color. I put the heart in the center, and notice that the heart is actually open and exposed to regardless of what is going through. I know as a man of color, regardless of what I've gone through, being raised by my wonderful parents and even my grandfather, is never allowing the hate to settle in your heart. Because hate in your heart only destroys you, not the person who you feel has brought that hate towards you. And so that openness is to constantly leave that exposed for that passion and that bridge per se, right? For conversation. And then just in the body, I always like to leave different images. Some images I take, some that I pull, just to kind of show the journey. So with that, dealing with equal rights and all of the journey of men of color within the body. The barbed wire that you see there is, again, that confinement, that limitation of you can't go beyond this point, right? And unfortunately, a lot of people feel that because those walls are put up there, not trying to break through them, they allow those walls to actually confine them. And so you can see that in that piece. You can see the barbed wire in these two pieces as well as the American taboo piece that's there. So you'll see throughout my work that I have certain elements that are there. And so from that transition here, I then moved to actually these pieces. This piece here was the neighborhood piece here, American Gothic, and these. So I'll start here real quick. So this piece right here is called Neighborhood Watch, and it actually is a play off of American Gothic. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Grant Wood's American Gothic. And Gordon Parks, the famous African-American photographer, also did a play off American Gothic as well. But this is actually my experience as a young African-American male when my dad, who was Air Force, Vietnam vet, we were one of 4 African-American families in this huge subdivision. So of course, a lot of things experienced going in the stores, my mom and my brother and I being followed, or even neighbors making certain comments. And so that's what that piece kind of resembles. And so as a kid, understanding and seeing that, this is kind of the vision that I had. And so I just wanted to kind of show that. And I also want us to think about, when we think about neighborhoods now, how different they are than they were in the 40s, 50s, 60s, right? Even the family structure, how different all these things are. And so I just wanted to kind of bring light to that in this piece, in my experience. And then also, how has that changed? Again, tying back to bridges and walls, even in our own neighborhoods. And I have a wonderful neighborhood that Mikel and I moved in. I see my neighbors sitting right here. Love them dearly, who welcomed us. So great neighborhood. But knowing that and understanding that, which is beautiful too, to see where I am now to what I experienced then, gives that hope and that bridge that's there. So from that piece, I actually moved to these pieces here. And I am going to talk about one piece in particular here. And this is where I felt the transition was really happening for me, bringing both worlds together. And this piece in particular that I want to bring out is called My Life for Skittles. I don't know how many of you are still familiar with the Trayvon Martin story. And that was a tribute to Trayvon Martin, this piece here. And this is where, again, I wanted to evoke that emotion that we feel with the fine arts aspect, with movement and color. And this was challenging for me because, again, allowing the paint, allowing movement to happen, I wanted some elements of features in it because my whole goal was to, again, I love trying to portray what's happening on the inside, Because a lot of times, we can kind of put up a wall and a facade, all of us, on how we really feel. You know, we can put on the poker face. Why? We can't go to our jobs, we can't go to certain places and really express how we truly feel inside, what we're going through, whether it's personal, or whatever the case may be. And there's so much stirring up within. And so my goal was to bring that out as long as well as having the features so you can kind of understand kind of the both worlds behind that. And so I think I want to stop there and leave it open for questions for anyone, because I know that's a lot. So, any questions, comments? Yes?
I have one. Can you tell me why you used the sunflower and what that represents for you?
Well, sunflower. When you think about the sunflower, I think kind of the Midwest. I'm originally from Tennessee, Memphis, Tennessee. But I always loved the sunflower. And the reason being because why? It's always searching for the sun. It's very tall. It's not, well, we would say it's not the prettiest thing, but I think it's a beautiful flower. But not only that, it has substance. Not only is it aesthetically pleasing, but it actually has a true function. And that function is, it has a nutrient, which is the sunflower seed that you can actually eat and get off of. So for me, that kind of represents that sunflower. It represents inner beauty. And so it was always a connection for me and the strength behind it. And so that's why I wanted to use it in that piece. Thank you. Any other questions? And about any piece, please, I know I didn't cover a few pieces in the back. And I'll probably elaborate on a few more. Any questions about any? Yes?
I would really love to hear about this.
Thank you. Yes. So that was the last piece for that. And as I talked about these pieces here, that piece is called We Are Human. And if you notice, there are different nationalities in there, right? Different features. And those are actually all women in that piece. And again, the cause is because we think about the aesthetic aspect. When we think of beauty, it's so many different elements to the word beauty, especially in our society. It's very surface. We really don't think about, we have one idea of what beauty is. And so my goal was I wanted to strip away all of that, right? And deal more with the inside again. The reason I use a lot of different colors is because, again, we're layered. We have different emotions, we have different experiences, and we have different encounters. And if you notice, even within kind of the chaos around the actual features there, I don't know if you can actually see the word human that I actually have there. And the reason I do that is because, again, unfortunately, we have to wear labels in a society that loves labels. And I think that's where we, again, limit ourselves and confine ourselves to that. And let me kind of rephrase that. When I think about society, certain societal labels, right? Certain societal labels that is put upon us. And one of them, for me, is the word beauty, when we think about beauty. And I think recently we're doing a better job, and I say I think about our society, we're doing a better job. We're seeing some representation of beauty. And hopefully we'll see more. Hopefully it'll open up. But yeah, that was just kind of a tribute to, again, the series that I was doing. And the series is called Fractured Soul. And so that's a piece that's actually a part of that. Yes?
I've noticed that your earlier work, and I didn't look at the timeline, are very indicative of your illustration background.
Right.
And then and I'm assuming these are your latter work.
Yes.
And they become more expressive
Yes.
and quote unquote painterly and therefore finer.
Yeah.
What are your influences and how did you derive from that to that? And that transition to me is fascinating. And as an artist, as we all are, these are bridges you want to gap at some point in taking directions. And I know we have influences. So who are they and why?
My two main influences, of course, was Marin and Jean-Michel Basquiat. Two of my favorite. And you can kind of see the influence in the work because I think they both were so before their time. And unfortunately, Jean-Michel, he passed way before he even grew into his genius, I feel. But even now seeing his work trend, people truly understanding the work that he does, the primitive aspect that he took with the emotional component, as you said, the expression, right? The emotion truly coming out on the page. And that's something for a while that I've been trying to trying to tap into. And until this residency, until doing these two pieces where I allowed myself to where they could actually come. Now, I'm inspired by so many other, Wayne Tebow. There's so many that I could talk about too. And I'm glad you brought that point because I think as artists as well, even as I teach my students, I say it's okay to be inspired and influenced by others. In fact, we all are, whether we realize it or not. And that's what I talk about though, going back to bridges and walls. We kind of create that and open that up for people, even if we don't have an encounter verbally with them. Just even our actions of how we carry ourselves, right, can inspire and encourage. And so I tell my students, always be inspired by that. Now, never try to emulate or duplicate, because as an artist, that's where we can fall in that trap as well, especially when things aren't working for us. We tend to go to the easy, right? And so that's what I found myself fighting with these.
Thank you.
You know,
They're really dynamic and makes you think as you look at these new pieces, because you captured it and yet you've also obliterated all this iconography that you often use that are so overtly real. You've taken that out of these and yet you've given it some new soul, some new dynamism.
Wow, thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you so much.
I was going to ask about your, because I use collage too, and I'm curious if you're painting and then collage and painting, or you paint, starting with that and the collage pieces are talking to you as you're, can you talk a little bit about that?
It's both. So I always start out conceptually. I always start out by sketching it out. As I sketch it, I kind of build from that to see. And then that's when I then research for the elements that I want to put into it. And I research and say, do I want to use my own eye? Do I want to use my kid's eye, my wife's eye, when she doesn't realize it? But then that's when I start to really research, because for me, the journey is the process of getting to that. For me, I live in the process. So taking those steps, getting it. Sometimes I would start like, for this piece, I knew exactly what I wanted to do, so I found that Skittles. I wanted to find different Skittles bags and kind of put them together to kind of create a weird shape. And I put it there and I thought about the face because I had it sketched out and I said I want to do the nose and the eye. But then I wanted the colors because the emotion really connected with me. I kept thinking about, because I have an 18-year-old son. And so I keep thinking if that was my son. It's those emotions that I kept thinking back and going to. And so for that, I wanted to get into the paint. And I actually started with that one. I actually started with paint like a kindergarten on my fingers. I didn't even use a brush. I just put it on my hand and just put it on there because I wanted that true connection. And then I started to build with brush and then my mark making tools. And then after I created a base structure near the mouth, that's when I wanted to bring in the eye. Now, someone had asked, which I wanted to do, but in respect to the family, because I didn't reach out, I wanted to use an eye of Trayvon Martin for that piece. But because I didn't talk to them or get approval, I didn't want to do that. Because that's the image that came out for me. And so I then added an eye to it and then started to build it out. So it really depends. It's, I go in thinking one way, and just like as artists know, you get something and then it changes for you. Because again, being open and allowing the materials to speak to you, to kind of guide you. So thank you.
Yeah, one of the things I love about your work is that first I saw the paint, I saw the feeling that you had, this, either rage or, what was the how do I say, the essence of feeling, I suppose. And then as I came closer, I saw the image that you were creating with the paint and your collage pieces. The image itself of those combination of pieces, which to me is really delightful because as you move across it, you can see that more than in one way. You can see it in several ways. It's almost like a three-dimensional issue.
Well, thank you. And I'm thank you for bringing that up because that is something even in the paint, that's why I want to portray, because I keep talking about the transitions and the different things that we feel and we go through different emotions. And even with the pieces, and as artists, we know sometimes that can be very difficult to really capture that, because you're limited one way or the other. And so, I was hoping that would come out. Some pieces I felt it did, some pieces I'm like, oh, geez, I hope they see it. It's kind of like, well, I'll let the viewers kind of tell me it is. But as artists, and so you kind of have to just let it be because, again, we can overthink and overanalyze things. So it's like, just let the work do. And even for these pieces, my biggest challenge, because with these pieces, as you said, because they're so literal, you kind of know the beginning and the end. right? You have the composition already there. But when you're dealing with fine art, when you're dealing with abstract expressionism, it's hard to, for me, I know even now, you have to navigate and figure out, is it too much? Did I overdo it? Did I under? So that was a big challenge. And that's where I truly had to trust what I felt the first time when I looked at the piece, stepped back, turned it upside down, sideways, turned around, looked back at it, and whatever feeling that I felt then, it's like, okay, I'm gonna trust that and then walk away from it. So it took a while for me to actually get to that point. Because there were actually a total of 25 pieces that I was supposed to have for the show. 3 of them I didn't finish. I was like, well, I'm not gonna try, but even those 3 pieces, the reason I couldn't finish is because it was in that point where I was like, I don't know. So since I didn't know, I wasn't gonna force it. And so I left them there. So for me, again, the process, it's the process for me that I really love. That's why I feel I really grow. Yes, sir.
It was really interesting because I'm so apolitical. I really don't care about politics and art. I really don't. And I kind of knew there was a kind of racial element to your show. And so when I came up, I was thinking, I'm not really going to be into this. And then I was just blown away. And you know, by the fact that it seems like the art comes first and the message is in there also. And I just love that. That I can explore and love just your technique and the art and your creativity, and then the message is in there also. So that was kind of nice for me. 2 other things I thought about was the barbed wire is interesting because I never think of the barbed wire with any significance in terms of the black experience, but I do think about it in terms of the Jewish experience. And so I kind of like that it's in there because it talks about oppression across the board and tragedies. The other thing that your artwork made me think about, and you talk about connections, and particularly connections in art history and artists, William de Kooning.
Yes.
Yeah, well, that's interesting because I didn't think you would agree with me, but William de Kooning did his women series, and he put a mouth on the canvas and then painted the woman abstractly around the mouth. And it made me think about that, you know.
Well, thank you for that, Mike. And to your point, that was my goal with the work, because we see so many messages, and especially if they're so overtly in our face, that's the pushback with conversation. And that's why I talk about the bridge and the wall, because it's funny, I had a conversation with a friend and we talked about it, and my friend who's Italian, and we talked about the incidents that happened. And the one thing is, he said was, you know what, it's funny because there are times to where when I really want to know something about it, but then it could get to a point to where it's so in my face where I'm like, man, I feel so guilty. I don't even want to talk about it. And I get it. And at the same time, it's like, well, how can we, because that's a real feeling. And a lot of times you want to hear one side say, well, get over it. And it's like, I'm sorry, we're human. So we have to figure out, how can we get beyond those walls that we all have? Because until we figure that out, we're not going to have the conversation. It's 2021. We're still having conversations that Dr. King talked about when I have a dream. Still having these conversations. And so what does that mean? That we haven't had the conversation. And how can you have the conversation? Well, my goal is, I feel art is always that. Art and music, the arts, which in the 80s, unfortunately, we kind of suppressed it. But I'm glad it's coming back to where, and because of the pandemic, I think people understood the importance of art. And so now they realize with art, you can sit here and have a group painting and talk about any topic and realize that you actually talked about the topic. Why? Because we all had our walls kind of brought down. Because why? Subconsciously, we were in something else and doing something else, but in that we were able to have a conversation. So that's what I wanted to do with my pieces. I wanted people to kind of look and be like, oh wow, this is interesting, this is different, oh I like it, and get in and say, whoa, what is that? Oh wow, oh I didn't realize that. And then they can read it and not feel that they have to be defensive or not feel that it's necessarily pointed at them or us, right? To where it's open to have that dialogue. Back to when the atrocities happened and everyone talked about having those courageous conversations. And one comment that I heard was someone said, well, being a person of color, I shouldn't have to do the work for you, or I shouldn't have to have that conversation. And I thought about that and I disagreed. I said, because as a person of color, there's a point in time to where people didn't want to know my story. And now people are asking, and people are even asking, and I've had people come and say, I don't know how to ask this, but I just want to know how you feel it. Now, I could have easily said, oh, here we go, man, I can't speak for every African American. Because usually that's what happens, and that's the approach. And so for me, I said, I have to figure out how to have that conversation even on my part. And so when I think about indifference, I think about a lot of my friends, a lot of colleagues, where we kind of have these conversations and we talk about how, because of how the conversation started, or because of how they were approached in the conversation, it immediately created this wall to where there was this indifference that, well, you know what? It's not happening to me, you know, because I didn't experience. That's where I feel the pushback comes in conversations. And so that piece kind of stems toward that. Oh, wow. Okay. Yes.
I just want to know what your art process is like. Are you someone who paints or draws every day, or is it, you've been an artist for so long, but you're teaching, you have kids, you have a wife, like there's life that happens.
Oh,
Like,
yeah.
how do you do, it's not like when you have just, you know,
Free time.
free
Yeah,
time
yeah.
to just enjoy your art. So, and do you go to art openings and exhibits of other people just to get a break and a breather?
Well, good question. Yeah, it was a transition, figuring that out. It's always finding out that happy spot, I would say, right? I do draw every day, and I even do digital. If I know that I can't, I have an iPad, so Procreate, which I had snubbed my nose at for a while because I'm a traditionalist. But I'm so open to it because even just concepts, I can actually create things, which now I'm creating NFTs. I know, don't shame me. I know the artists are like,
What's
okay.
an NFT? I don't know.
Oh,
I'm not
that's
very-
new, it's a non-fungible token, it's a new thing. Now, I won't give my answer, but anyway, so I am creating on the iPad, and that's my thing, I have to draw every day, even if it's a thumbnail, even if it's 10 minutes, because I talk about that muscle memory, saying what I do with my kids. And so, my time now, which thankfully, again, back to the MOCA, I was actually finding different spots to create, because my home, I know my wife is so thankful now, but my home went from my kitchen to my dining room to our bedroom to the front room. That's why I was creating, and then of course I was afforded this wonderful space, and after this space, I finally made a move to convert my garage into a studio.
Nice.
And so now I have a set space anytime, because I'm a morning person, I wake up at 4:30 every morning. Because that's the most creative time, because everyone's asleep, it's quiet, and thankfully, because my mother was a teacher, I had to get up at 5 o'clock anyway. So it's embedded in me, so that's the time that I actually create. So it is every day. It's morning, afternoon, and not necessarily in the evening. Evening is more of getting my thoughts together for what the morning is going to be, because I shut down probably at 6 or 6:30. So now I'm in a space where I have a rhythm. I even know when I start creating, where that perfect spot to stop, because as artists, we struggle with figuring out when do I stop working on a piece. So all that over time now is in this perfect space. So
Awesome, thank you.
yeah, thank you. So I know some questions over here and then over here. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for doing this.
Oh, no, thank you.
This is great. Obviously, your technique and point of view are advanced and powerful. My assumption is, because we haven't known each other that long, but my assumption is it wasn't always that way.
Right.
We have a young artist in the family. How do you describe that journey of pulling together perspective, technique, point of view, confidence?
Yeah.
Can you just kind of take us through that in your
Yeah,
experience? How you
yeah.
arrived here?
It was understanding that it's more about your voice and not everyone else's. That's the first thing. And that's something as a teacher I always teach my students. My mantra is art is your voice. With it, you can say what you want, when you want, as loud as you want. Just make sure what you say is worth hearing. So it's understanding that you do have something important to say first. Second part is know that you're never going to like the last piece you did. Picasso said it best. Yeah, I just went blank what Picasso said. Oh, he said basically that once you're satisfied with every piece of work that you've painted, then that means that it's time for you to die. And it's Picasso being Picasso. I understood what he's saying because there's always a growth.
Yep.
And I tell my students to keep their old work as well, because that's your gauge. Now, the thin line for that as a young artist, and I know Courtney's in college now, figuring things out, it's you try to figure out, one, you want to keep certain pieces, but at the same time, as I joked earlier about not being the biggest collector of your work, you still have to have a point to where you can separate yourself, because what can happen is you can keep all this old work and it'll be hard for you to kind of create new work, because then that fear of not creating what you just created. So in a nutshell, it's labor. It's a lot of hit and misses. I don't like to call them failures. I like to say lessons learned, because Bob Ross said it best, happy accidents. A lot of times you kind of have to create 1,000 pieces to get that one piece. And that's the thing I teach a lot of my students, and especially for this generation, it is harder for them because they are used to a lot of instantaneous things. So understanding that I might have to work out 5 pieces, right? Start them, finish them, change them, and not even like them, and then have the one piece that I do like, and understand that that's the process and that's okay. So it's growth and maturity. I think by the time she's maybe 27, 28, it'll be a new transition. Mine happened at 18, 30, 37, now 50. That was my transition. And as an artist, I really feel now I actually know my voice after painting for over 40-something years. And I think that challenge is because I was a graphic designer first, and then became a fine artist, because I was told I couldn't do both and trying to figure out how to do both. For some, it might not take as long.
Can you share, oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, yes.
Just to add on to that, can you share your experience of, there was a period of time when you stopped?
I did, yeah. In fact, when I was teaching, around 2010 or 2011, and that was because being an artist, wanting my work in galleries, and this is where that growth period happened, I realized that because of my socially conscious work, that everyone didn't want my work. And so I said, that's okay. I started to settle. And then of course a patron of our school came, who's an artist herself, and saw our work and asked if I had shown anywhere. And I said, you know what? I'm not trying to show any work because people really don't like or get my work. And the comment she made that helped spark it again, she said, well, everyone hasn't, or the right person hasn't seen your work. And so that's something that I had to remember as an artist. And that's something also artists have to realize, that there's a certain market for those who want to get into it professionally for your work. Someone is out there. But again, I also tell my students, don't get in the trap of creating because you want others to like it. It should be your heart, it should be your expression. Just create the work, those who like it will come.
I think you kind of answered this, but I'm gonna ask the question anyway. In regards to building like your portfolio for young people like me who just graduated pandemic, what sort of advice would you give to someone who's worried about building enough of a portfolio to show or to establish yourself professionally? Any kind of words of wisdom to bounce off the past 2 questions? Or
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And I want my other artists too. I want you all to chime in too as well. but no, seriously, it's one, you have to, and I hate using this word, but especially if you want to kind of get into the art world, you have to understand that you're a commodity. So you have to market yourself. And as artists, that's the hardest thing, because it's hard being both creative and business. But in the beginning, you have to establish relationships. So visit many studios, professional artists, go to many galleries, even if they don't do walk-ins. Act as if you didn't know they didn't do walk-ins. Just show your work, right? Because what I noticed even in galleries, you have a high turnaround with curators and people in galleries. And I'm sure Amy can speak on this too. You want to leave an impression, right? And as artists, that's the key, that impression. So you're going to have to do a lot of footwork, getting your stuff out there. Get a website. You can start with an inexpensive or free website just to get started, just so it's on the internet, because now the internet is a huge place for artists. Go to museums. That's where your inspiration comes from. So for a beginning artist, I tell them that's where the work starts. You got to do a lot of legwork. And it's going to be days where you're like, I am tired of doing this. I don't know if this is what I want to do.
right.
And if you ask yourself that, then ask yourself, could you live without doing art?
Right.
One question I tell people is, what can you do for the rest of your life and not get paid for it?
Right. Yeah.
And if art is what you can do, then that's what you have to do.
Yeah.
And
Thank you.
Please, I see the eyes. You can chime in. No? Okay.
Yeah, I would say, do what you love, because that's the thing that's going to keep you doing it, for 12 hours a day. in spite of the low times and everything, just keep doing what you're doing. And the other thing is, I would say, get out there and be in the art world, whether it's, like you said, it's going to galleries, going to museums. When I first moved to the Bay Area, I just went to every gallery just to visit galleries so people would recognize my face. And now people know me through San Francisco. Sometimes they don't even know why they know me, but they've seen me so many times that they know me.
Great.
Myself, before I answer. Amy?
Amy,
Yeah, I was just curious if you could talk a little bit about what's next for you, what's coming down the pipe in 2022.
Wow, what is coming up? I actually do have a show, actually it's going to be in outside of Seattle, Washington. Depending on COVID, it'll either be in person, to where I'm actually going to go visit with the body of work and do an artist talk there as well, or if not there, then it will be via Zoom. And then also for me, just more painting, more getting work out there. Definitely working with my students as the school year continues. And so that's the thing too, as artists, it's just the next opportunity, on to the next one. Thank you. Yeah.
Oh.
Oh, go ahead,
I just want to say I'm really proud because I was on the committee when they were selecting the artist in residence, and so we thought about it and we all loved you, and so you're a credit to the decision that we made.
Oh, thank you.
I agree.
Well, I have like 20 questions.
Okay.
So luckily I know Mikhail, so I'll probably be emailing you later.
Okay.
But I guess one question maybe for now is how, you touched on the pandemic a little bit and your perception on how that affected artists, but for you specifically, how did the pandemic affect your art? Were you creating more art, less art, the same? And you talked about, being a human and being an artist, and these topics are so heavy and you're carrying all of it and you're choosing which parts to express when and which pieces. I'm just curious what that experience is like for you as a human and through the pandemic.
Yeah, good question. So pandemic for me, and it's one of those where as an artist, I always try to find the words to say, but that's where for me, my greatest exposure came was during the pandemic. My work blossomed from shows. I mean, over the pandemic last year, I probably had from actual pieces in shows, being part of group exhibitions, over 20.
Wow.
During the pandemic. Before then, so during a time of tragedy, in that regards, is when my actual work blossomed, and of course, because of the subject matter. And I think back to my friend, the patron, who told me the right people hadn't seen it. Again, I don't believe in coincidence. And so I think there's a time for everything to happen. And unfortunately, because of those atrocities, that was the time for my work. And as far as artistically, I actually grew then because it forced me to actually stay at that table. Even though I love doing it, ideas were really coming during that time. And I saw my work grow during that time. And going back to the human component, what was that third question?
Oh, how do you hold all
Yes.
of that? Yeah.
So now, and I think the struggle at first was because I kept running away from it. Now I'm open to whatever I feel. And when that happens, I'm quick to go and create concepts of the idea. And sometimes the concepts will sit there, like this show and my endangered species show, it sat for 3 years. It was just something that I just make sure I get it out of my brain onto paper. That way it can grow, it can breathe. I can either come back to it if I feel it's something that I need to or not. So for me, that process is getting it out on paper to look at it differently and then kind of build from it. So now it's a matter of whatever comes my way, I don't push it back, I don't suppress it. I write it down, check back into it, and see if there's something that I need to continue. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Well, so everyone, thank you again. Thank you for being patient. Thank you for being here. I really appreciate it. And any other questions, please, I know my business cards and I have a card there. Please email me. I love talking art. I can talk art all day. So feel free to email my neighbors. They already know they can knock on the door. But thank you all so much, and continue to support the arts, continue to support kids, and I do want to give this last comment too, especially for our, being a teacher and seeing mental health issues
Oh,
that are really, really hitting our kids. I know it's hitting all of us, but to really see it in teenagers. And so even if you give them some crayons and paper, allow them to have an outlet and just help support that expression one way or the other, whether it's music, whether it's art. They need this outlet. And I know we live in a society that wants to commercialize it and not realize the actual health behind that outlet. So just continue, please, to support the arts any way that you can. So thank you, everyone.